Normally at this time of year, I would be getting excited to be helping Michelle Lepton kick off her annual Case Me a Christmas Card feature. This year, Michelle's decided to take a break, and when she gave me that news, I was so disappointed. Michelle is such a lovely and inspiring person and crafter, and I look forward to this every year, and it turns out I'm not the only one. So a bunch of us got together and we decided to throw Michelle a surprise party filled with lots of friends casing her cards. And the best part? You can join too if you want. I'll tell you how in a few minutes. For now, let's get started with one of Michelle's cards and some limes. If you've been here before, you know about limes. The letters of this zesty acronym stand for list, include, modify, exclude, and spin. And they can help you analyze your inspiration and then change it up so that you can make it your own. Here's the card I chose from Michelle's blog as my inspiration. It's super cute and not even a Christmas card. Whenever I analyze an inspiration, I start by listing all the attributes of it. In fact, I think this is the most important part of limes, identifying what elements of the inspiration you want to use. So let's take a look. First, I break it down into 3 categories. I start with colors. Michelle's card has purple, pink, yellow, black, and white. Next, I look at techniques. I see die cutting and ink blending. And finally, I look at the elements. Michelle has used a cover plate die in a really creative way, which I think is so clever. There are 2 patterned elements, one in the top left and one in the bottom right corner. The pattern is geometric with hearts in it, and then she's added a die-cut birthday sentiment, along with some black gems or drops as embellishments. It's clean and simple, but it has a ton of visual interest. For my first card, I played off Michelle's clever idea of using 2 pieces of the cover plate die and tried to get a similar look with a stencil. I've got the largest waffle flower grip mat here to help hold my cardstock and stencil in place, and I'm using the grid on my glass work surface to help me center it, so I can try and center the stenciling. I'm using the Hero Art Snowflake pattern stencil, and instead of putting it into a corner, I'm going to put a quarter of the stencil onto my cardstock. The grip mat is holding the stencil in place where it has contact, but that corner sitting on top of the cardstock can flip up, so I need to be careful. You could use pixie spray if you prefer to get a better grip between the stencil and the cardstock. I want that corner to be along the center line of my cardstock, and I need to leave a clear area in the middle for a couple of reasons. One is to leave space for the sentiment, and I'll explain the other one when I get to it. Next, I'm ink blending, and you'll notice that I stayed with Michelle's colors of yellow, pink, and purple. Not traditional colors, but I think I can make it work. I started with the party dress ink, bringing it down almost to the tip of the stencil, and initially focusing more on getting color down than worrying too much about a smooth blend. I'm using the small Altenew blending brushes. I prefer the control I get when I can hold onto the brush right above the bristles, and I find these ones easy to store in a fairly small space in a drawer. I moved on to my Flirty Fuchsia at the top of the panel, and then back to the party dress to blend. Before I moved on to Catching Rays, I cleaned off the stencil to try and minimize any contamination on my brush and my ink pad, and I brought this yellow color down below the stencil, but not too far. I'll create my second pattern by moving the stencil in a couple of minutes to the other end of the cardstock, and I want those edges to be as crisp as possible, so I don't want to get yellow ink into that area. And that's another reason why I didn't bring the corner of the stencil down any further on the cardstock. I noticed that my yellow ink pad was pretty dry, and that just makes it difficult to get a smooth blend, and no one wants a more difficult life, so I stopped for a second and I added some ink to it. When I'm going to be blending with it right after a refill, I don't worry too much about overfilling it or anything like that. The blending will help remove any excess ink I may have added to the ink pad and leave it ready for stamping next time I want to use it. Now you're probably looking at my blending and thinking, that's not really that smooth, but I've got 2 secret weapons. The first is that these inks smooth out as they dry, and it will definitely look better. But even if it doesn't, secret weapon number 2 will fix it. Stick around to see what it is. But for now, I cleaned the stencil, moved it to the other side, trying to line up the corner as best as I could with the blended pattern corner. I think it's kind of fun to make a feature of the edges of the stencil, as well as the snowflake pattern. Once I had the stencil in place, I followed the same steps, but this time I started with Catching Rays, and I worked down through the party dress and the Flirty Fuchsia until it was all filled in. Now I'm going to set that aside to dry and get to work on my second card. This time I'm using my cheater ink blending method where I use a gel plate and a brayer. I did a full video about this not too long ago, and I'll link it below in case you're interested. In that video, I seem to muddy up the colors a little bit, So this time I'm going to try something different. I'm going to put one color down at a time to see if I can get a little more control over where the blended areas are. I started with the catching rays and I put a few layers onto the index paper before I was happy with the saturation. This method does take a few layers, but using a brayer is so much easier than a brush, and the blend that you get is amazing. Then I moved down to the bottom of the plate and I put down the Flirty Fuchsia, and I printed a few layers of that, making sure to use as much of the ink off the brayer as I could. Finally, I put some of the Party Dress down the center of the gel plate and I brayered that out. Again, I needed a few layers, but you can see that I'm getting a really good blend between the colors, and it'll get even better as it dries. I trimmed it down and then I put it through my die cutting machine with this Origami embossing folder from Spellbinders. It has circles in the pattern, similar to Michelle's cover plate die. For my final card, I'm going to create some ink blended ornaments. I've got 3 different circle die cuts here on a grip mat, and I'll show you how to blend the ink to create the look of dimension and shine on these. First, I'm using even smaller blending brushes that will give me a lot more control over where my ink is going. I came in on the left side of each ornament, heavy on that side, and then fading out to white toward the center. I'm also putting some color all around the ornament, but I really want to leave a white highlight, just right of center on the circle. I usually use a comma-shaped highlight, but a small circle of white also works well and looks good. After I did the other 2 ornaments with the other 2 colors, I came back to each one with a darker shade of the same color. So Tiki Torch for the catching rays, Rockin' Red for the party dress, and Grape Crush for the Flirty Fuchsia. Putting just a little bit on the left edge of each ornament deepens the color and makes them look even rounder. And now it's time for my secret weapon number 2, and that's Iridescent Shimmer Spray. I would say that I'm actually pretty happy with all of this ink blending, but hey, these are Christmas cards, so a little shimmer is pretty much mandatory. And whenever my blend isn't so smooth, I add it to reactivate the ink a little bit and smooth it out. I also add gold splatter when my blending isn't perfect, and again, I'm doing it here just because I think it's a fun, festive touch on a Christmas card. Now, I've spent all this time building the colorful pieces for my cards, and here's a bunch of white die cuts I'm going to use to finish them. I've got a cover plate die cut, 2 2-layer snowflakes, and a couple of die cut sentiments. They also get the shimmer spray gold splatter treatment so that everything matches. And for the shadow of one of the die cut sentiments, I'm going to paint some white cardstock with that same gold watercolor. I really should have gotten a bigger brush out. I kept trying to decide whether it was worth it to get up and find a bigger brush or just use the smaller brush a lot less efficiently. Okay, so now on to card assembly. For card number 1, I'm adding a die cut Hero Arts Christmas word in that center area between the 2 stenciled patterns with liquid glue. I left the bouncy mid-century font, and I think it fits perfectly in its spot. Then I stamped a small Mary from Waffle flower. This Christmas die comes with a Mary die, but I wanted to be able to see the clean edges of the stencil edges, and I opted for a mixed sentiment. I finished it off with a few rose garden gems from Crafty Meraki. These gems have an illusion element, and that means they flash pink and yellow, depending on where you're looking at them from. When I went to put the panel on the card base, I felt like that big white border was a little boring, so I used an old stitching rectangle die, and I created a white mat. This adds a little visual interest, playing off the dots in the snowflake centers, as well as the gems, but it doesn't take your eye away from the focal panel at all. I like adding little touches like that. Okay, so let's take a look. I've included Michelle's colors, although mine are a little more intense. I've got 2 geometric pattern elements and a die cut sentiment. I've modified the technique from die cut to stencil. I've changed the proportions of color to white, as well as the placement of the 2 geometric patterns. My sentiment has a stamped word in it. My gems are pinky yellow instead of black, and of course I changed the occasion from birthday to Christmas. I don't think I really excluded anything, maybe the shadow behind the die cut sentiment. And my spin is the addition of those stitching dots. To finish the next card, I used that gel blended panel that was embossed, and for my 2 geometric elements, I'm using this layered snowflake die from A Pocket Full of Happiness. I glued the delicate outline layer to the backing to give a more solid feel to the snowflakes, and I glued one in the top left and one in the bottom right. This time my sentiment is a bold, solid Merry Christmas, stamped with black ink on a white strip. I added some iridescent dewdrops as my embellishments. Let's evaluate this one. Again, I've included all the colors and the basic layout. I've modified the card by using a colored background with white elements, and I put the geometric pattern on the background as well. I've got snowflakes to help Christmasize the feeling of this card, And I changed the sentiment from die cut to stamped. My embellishments are clear, although looking at it now, maybe black would have stood out a bit better. Okay, last one. I'm gluing my geometric cover plate die cut from Simon Says Stamp directly to my card base. This white on white background has interest, but it won't take away from my ornaments. Next, I glued the white die cut words to the shadows I cut from the cardstock I painted with the watercolor. And I was able to cut some ornament toppers from that same gold cardstock, and I glued those to my 3 ornaments. I arranged the ornaments in the top left and bottom right corners of my card, and I glued the yellow and pink ones directly to the card, and used some foam tape to pop up the purple one. I glued the die-cut words in the center, and I think you can see that I lost the dot for the eye. Here's a rescue strategy for that. I just used one of the same Enchanted Forest gems for the eye as I did for the rest of my embellishments. Now, how did I do? Again, I included the colors. This time, not only are they more intense, they're not blended together in any way, so that's a modify. Another modify is that I left out black and I added gold. My geometric pattern was created by a cover plate, but it's on my white background. My 2 colorful corner elements are circles, which kind of tie back to the circles in Michelle's die cuts. And this sentiment is probably the closest to Michelle's, die cut with a shadow, even though I've changed the colors. The nice thing about limes is that no one is going to come around and grade you on how well you did. It's just a way to give you a starting off point for transforming your inspiration into something new, and I hope you enjoyed seeing how I applied it. Now, we'd love to have you join the party. All you have to do is find one of Michelle's cards that you want to case, and actually I think that's going to be the hardest part, narrowing it down. Make a card of your own and then post it. You can even use limes if you want. Tag Michelle and use the hashtag CaseMeAChristmasCard2023. There's no deadline, just do it whenever you want. And you can follow that hashtag on Instagram so you can see all the crafters who are joining us and see how they were inspired by Michelle. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.